I call Kevin Haig.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I want to begin this contribution by making a bit of a comparison between two bills, because, Mr Speaker, the bill that the House has considered immediately prior to this, the substance addiction bill, is one that also deals with alcohol-related issues. But, Mr Speaker, it does so from a health perspective. It actually takes some measures that were in the law that largely had a justice orientation to them and replaces them with new measures that have a health orientation and specifically a harm reduction orientation. And yet here on this bill, we're back to dealing with alcohol-related issues, back to dealing with trying to reduce the amount of harm associated with alcohol consumption in our community, but doing so from a justice lens. And I'd urge the government perhaps to think about that, because here we have a bill that's been introduced on behalf of the Minister of Justice. It's going to be referred to the Justice and Electoral Law Select Committee, a select committee that, in fact, with all due respect to the members of that committee, does not have expertise around health issues and around harm reduction issues. And the signal that sends to the community is that the government has not yet made the shift of thinking. The shift of thinking from dealing with alcohol as an issue of justice but to one of dealing with alcohol as an issue of harm. Mr Speaker, it's a shift that the government ought to have made. The Act that this bill amends came from the Law Commission's report. The Law Commission's report was called Alcohol in Our Lives, Curbing the Harm. It set out to reduce harm. The Law Commission, in its recommendations, believed that the Act that we ought to have set up in 2012, actually the Law Commission thought we ought to have done it prior to that, but the Act that we should have set up, it recommended be called the Alcohol Harm Reduction Act, not the Sale and Supply of Liquor Act. And Mr Speaker, again, once again, an illustration of the failure to actually make that shift in thinking. The evidence is extremely strong about harm reduction, sir. We know pretty much that changes to alcohol-related behaviour, or at least we do in the health sector, sir, do not come about from prohibition. Equally, they don't come about from giving people education, which is perhaps counterintuitive. But it turns out that education, giving people information, may be a necessary prerequisite. But the thing that actually changes people's behaviour, consumption behaviour, is change to the environment. And that's why the Law Commission recommended that we should address availability of alcohol, where it could be purchased, when it could be purchased, the hours, licensing hours. They recommended that we address pricing, both minimum pricing and the excise tax. And they recommended that we introduce controls around advertising and sponsorship. All of those changes, sir, were recommended to change the environment in which alcohol purchase and consumption took place. So this bill, sir, is a welcome step forward. It does actually address that issue of a person, perhaps in their supermarket or some other shop, confronted with aisles worth of alcohol and actually not seeing the low alcohol options there, and providing that direct availability of that option, that low alcohol option, at the point of purchase. And I think I would agree with the point that Chris Bishop made, that it must surely have been an oversight of this Parliament not to have incorporated that change at the time. Similarly, the change around liquor licensing in companies. These were oversights of the House and of the government. And I guess my reflection would be that the mood that the government was in at the time that that bill was making its way through Parliament probably made it not conducive to careful thought about the detail. The government was not in a mood for looking at the detail, sir, or for countenancing any change to the bill that it put in front of the House. Mr. Speaker, I agree with some of the other speakers who've said that it's a shame that the government hasn't included some of the other measures that have also become apparent since we passed that bill into law. The changes, for example, that local government has called out for, some protection for communities against the bullying behaviour by the industry when they attempt to put in place local alcohol plans. The evidence that's come to light since we passed that bill and produced the Act around the balance of minimum pricing and use of excise tax to actually ensure that we reduce consumption without an unbalanced approach. I think, Mr. Speaker, that it's a shame that this bill hasn't been used to implement the recommendations of the panel that was led by Graham Lowe about restricting sponsorship and marketing activities from the industry. So those were all things that the government could have used this bill to do, since in fact we were setting out to change the Principal Act by this bill. So opportunities lost. Ultimately, sir, what the House will need to do is stop addressing this kind of issue with piecemeal legislation. What we need instead, and I've spoken on a number of occasions in this House about this, is a piece of legislation that provides a single integrated legal framework for the regulation of all of the drugs, both those that are currently legal and those that are currently illegal. It should be health-based, not justice-based, and the government clearly has a step further to go in that direction. It should be aimed at reducing harm, so using principles that in the health sector we are extremely familiar with around harm reduction. So preventing the harm in the first place if we can, mitigating it if we cannot in a stepwise process, and using the regulatory tools that we have available, sir, such as age, availability, price, restricting marketing, licensing or perhaps prescription in some cases, and a further principle of proportionality, regulating those substances in proportion to the risk that they might cause health-related harm. So a framework like that, sir, is the right approach. And Mr. Speaker, that approach would be one that pulled together different strands. It would use perhaps a base such as that the House has set up with the Psychoactive Substances Act, because that's precisely what that framework does, sir. And it would pull in alcohol legislation, tobacco legislation, and indeed, sir, the Misuse of Drugs Act, substances currently controlled using that act, to actually produce for this country a genuinely 21st century framework that minimised the harm to this country and its citizens from drug use, sir. Thank you.